Welcome, everybody. This is David Kim with another installment of the dialogue series, Love-Driven Politics. This is a dialogue series with thinkers, activists, artists, and concerned citizens seeking to forge a public life animated by compassion, mercy, generosity, and radical love. And it's my pleasure to have with us today the great Brian McLaren. Brian is an author, speaker, activist, and public theologian. He's known around the world for his words of wisdom, his motivation, the author of at least a dozen books and probably the author of 3 dozen or more articles and sermons. But let me just give a title of some of the more recent books. His great 2006 title, The Secret Message of Jesus, followed by A New Kind of Christianity, Why Did Jesus, Moses, the Buddha, and Muhammad Cross the Road? And my understanding is that you're putting the finishing touches on a new book called The Great Spiritual Migration, How the World's Largest Religion is Seeking a Way to be Christian.
Yep.
All right. So welcome, Brian.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
Yeah.
And thanks for saying all those nice things. You didn't mention my good looks and great hair or anything, but anyway.
And I also didn't mention that you're a musician, with the guitars in the background. But I hope to touch on many of those things. Brian, for those folks who don't know you, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background, how you got to this point.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, first, it really is a pleasure to be with you, David. I'm a big fan of the good work that you're doing.
Thank you.
And we're all in this together, and glad for all the people who are interested in love-driven politics. I grew up in upstate New York in a very conservative little religious group. It would be called fundamentalist today. Some people have heard of the Plymouth Brethren, made famous maybe most by Garrison Keillor, who, when he tells his stories of Lake Wobegon, he talks about that background. They're the.
And it's good to know that you're above average, then, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. They're the originators of a school of theology called dispensationalism, and so all the talk of the rapture and so on comes from the people of my heritage. And I grew up, had a wonderful childhood, great loving family, and faith and so on was just part of my life. I went through a lot of questioning as a teenager, ended up, I think I was pretty much on my way out of religious life, ended up having a kind of dramatic spiritual experience that put me back on a spiritual path, but maybe not in those same categories that I inherited. I was a college English teacher. That was my career path. And then I got involved in a little experimental congregation, ended up leaving teaching to become a pastor in that community. I served there for 24 years. And while I was there, I started writing books. And so I left the pastorate 10 years ago. I've been writing, especially on the intersection of faith and public life, faith in the common good. And changes and challenges that I think faith communities are facing. And this next book that I have coming out is really the first section especially is really focused on the question of whether love really is what religion is about. So
right.
It's an important topic.
No, absolutely. And, before we get to love, because there'll be plenty of love talk in the conversation, I'm curious, given your background, as you say, you might have been called a fundamentalist. I've heard you describe yourself now as an evangelical progressive Christian. How do you make sense of help folks make sense of that identity who may hear those as a series of disjunctions?
Yeah. Well, of course, each word, each label that gets used has a history, and each label is contested and always undergoing, changes in what it means. It's just a fact that my background was fundamentalist, and in some ways, people jokingly define evangelicals as a fundamentalist with a bachelor's degree, and that certainly did describe my dad was a medical doctor, so he had more than a bachelor's degree, but. The term evangelical, I'm sort of trying to edit myself right now because I just watched a video by Samantha Bee of the show Full Frontal, where she just did a history of evangelicalism.
Oh, there you go.
And
did you see yourself in that history?
Fortunately, not that history. But what she talks about is the history of evangelicalism from the 1970s, a story that the historian Randall Ballmer, I think, has told very well. If you go before the 1970s, you might say that the evangelical tradition that goes back in English, in the English-speaking world, really to the 17th century, was a stream of the faith, of Christian faith, that emphasized personal experience. It was more than just a set of conceptual doctrines or a set of rituals that you put your body through. There was a desire for the heart to be warmed, and the idea of the warm heart, it was is part of my tradition that I still cherish, and that I think is part of what it means to be human. The other maybe positive sense of that word, evangelical, is the idea that you have good news that you want to share. Now, my belief is that each tradition has some baggage and some problems, but also has some wonderful good news to share. So in that sense, I love to be around evangelicals of every persuasion in this sense that they want to share their treasures with others. Having said that, I'm aware that, in the last generation or so, that evangelicals became, in some ways, the Republican Party's chaplaincy, and along with conservative Catholics as well. So I'm, that's not descriptive of me, but it is descriptive of an awful lot of my relatives.
Yeah, one of the fascinating things I find in your story, but also in your self-presentation, are the ways in which you have described yourself as being a part of a people, a part of a community, a part of a tradition, and yet distinct from it in critical ways.
Yeah.
And, talk to me about that experience of being of a people, of a tradition, of a community, and yet holding that community critically accountable.
Yeah. Well, I suppose there are many dimensions to this. One is what the community allows. Some communities do not allow people to have a critical stance. If you become critical, you're expelled.
Right.
But I think most mature communities have a place where they value the loyal critic. And the person who thinks critically about the community and the tradition. I'm thinking in the Hebrew scriptures, that you have the priestly tradition, but you also have the prophets, the poets, and the sages. So in the Bible, you have a book like Ecclesiastes, which is full of what we might call doubt, skepticism, questioning, certainly critical thinking. You have the prophets who are ready to say that the tradition has lost its way. And you have the poets who are willing to express agony and angst in the midst of the tradition. So it seems to me mature traditions have room for that. But I also think there's a personal dimension to this that a lot of us, I think some people manage to grow up in a tradition that they're just completely happy with, and it fits like a glove, and it just goes fine. But for a whole lot of us, we either have questions about our history, questions about the present, that make us sit uneasily within that tradition. And often we're made to feel that we're being disloyal. But then you realize, no, every tradition, if it doesn't keep growing like that, it really becomes a dead tradition. So.
Sure, absolutely. Well, it seems to me that one of the challenges, right, and you speak of personal experiences, like one of the challenges here is, well, how does one remain loyal to, as you say, a tradition or a community, but also know that we live in the world not wholly just of that community.
Yeah.
Right.
Sorry,
so,
I'm getting beats here. It's my fault.
That's okay. But and maybe this is also a question of calling. I mean, you said you're of a people, of a tradition that have good news to share, which we might otherwise call the Gospels, and yet in the act of sharing, you'll meet defiance. In the act of sharing, you'll meet resistance. In the act of sharing, you'll be confronted with disbelief.
Yeah.
Which for those inside of your tradition or community might be viewed as disloyalty, might be viewed as, charitably maybe as detraction, but really as a kind of deprivation.
Yeah.
Right. And so this kind of these multiple stakeholders, this multiple mode of accountability is a kind of complex spiritual psychology, right?
Yeah. I live in Southwest Florida, so just down the road is a little pond, and there's a bunch of alligators in the pond. And what typically happens is you have a big bull alligator. He's happy to have all the males in the pond that want to be there. But if any male comes in, there's a deference pyramid that gets established, and he'll drive away anyone perceived to be a threat. And the fact is, there's a good bit of that kind of marking of territory in a lot of communities that certain people with power, and in my tradition, it often happens to be powerful men and usually powerful white men, but that can vary. But, there is a certain deference that they require, and if they don't get that deference, then they have a way of edging people out.
Right.
But the fact is, that's part of life. I just don't see how that. I just think those dynamics are placed in all kinds of communities. And what a lot of people do is they become, they're maybe born into one community, and there are a lot of problems with it, and they make what I call a lateral conversion. In other words, they go from that community to another community. And after some period of time, they usually find out that the same dynamics are present in the second community that were in the first. And at that point, I think there's the possibility for what I might call, instead of a lateral conversion, a forward conversion, which would be to have a different, consciousness, a different mindset of the way that you would have a community.
Right.
In other words, you stop saying, "Oh, the problem is that community," and you realize, no, this is a human problem. This is, and we've all got to figure out how to negotiate our identities and our belongings.
Well, but on the note of the bull alligators, right? Which is another way of talking about power and authority.
Yeah.
Right? And that's one ways in which religious actors will see themselves converging with politics, right?
Yes.
And so if politics is in one in one of its iterations, the seeking of power, right, the control of order, how I guess maybe the question I want to ask is, how does someone of deep faith, deep commitments, find not just translations, but to resist the temptation to say, what I believe should be the world order, what I believe should be the order of the world outside of the community, right? I mean, because much of what you're talking about is the ways in which evangelical progressives, as it were, have gotten a bad rap.
Yeah.
Right. And part of what I take your work to do is to rehabilitate the perception and the reputation of the kinds of actors that you are.
Yeah, that's another whole subject, because I'll just give you a quick example. So in the evangelical community, I've been part of the conversations and part of the people who, for the last 20 or 25 years, have been the minority voice and have been saying, we've got to care about poor people and not just blame poor people for being poor. But I've noticed a subtle temptation. There's a difference between actually caring about people who suffer from poverty and caring about the reputation of your group, wishing it had a better reputation. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There's a very subtle thing where you can end up caring more about the reputation of your group than you actually care about any of the issues.
But is it so subtle, really? I mean,
you're right. It's
right, because it's a quality of the motivation, right? It's a question about integrity of agency and action. Yeah. Right. And so that if one's motivations are to look good as opposed to doing good.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
This is it exactly. And this is one of the real challenges in our faith communities. And it's certainly not unique to Christianity, because I come from a Christian background. I know the most about that. But our sacred texts are full of exhortations to love the outsider, to love the outcast, to even love the enemy.
Right. And the least amongst us.
And the least amongst us. Yet, I have to be honest. I see this in myself, but I certainly see it in my religious community. There's a big part of our religious identity that's built on hostility.
Right.
We're not like them.
Right.
We know who we are by defining ourselves in opposition to those who mistreated us, those who misunderstand us, those who go against our values, and so on. And so ironically, well, I remember really confronting this when I wrote a book a few years ago on religious identity and violence. And I came across a scholar who had really studied violent religious extremism. And he made this comment. He said, the people who put on a suicide vest, the people who do horrible acts of violence, don't perceive themselves as acting in hate toward them. They perceive themselves as acting in love toward us. And because we love us, we've got to go against the enemies of us. So their self-perception is very different from...
Right. So then, this does bring us to the question of the quality of that love in question.
Yeah.
Right. If we're going to be talking about things like public love, we're going to talk about things about radical love or love-driven politics. How do we adjudicate an ennobling and enabling love in distinction to precisely the kind of love that you just talked about? Love of one's own over the love of others. Right. And how do you make those kinds of distinctions and pronouncements such that they can be heard?
Yeah.
Right. Because it's one thing to be heard to those who are already anticipating or are receptive to that. Yeah. It's another thing to be heard to someone who says, I'm sorry, my view of love is actually quite different.
Yeah. Yeah. If I could make a potentially, a sort of revealing confession. So, I'm married. I've been married for a long time. My wife and I love each other deeply, but I have to be, and we've been faithful to each other through all these years, but I have to be honest that as a male, I have biological temptations to be unfaithful to my spouse. Right. It's not any failure of hers. I won't even call it a failure of mine. It's just part of what I inherited. And in order to be faithful, I'm constantly having to exercise a kind of self-control that requires me to go against some things that are sort of natural drives within me. I think we have something similar that happens to us on a social, psychological level. I think there are tendencies within us to look for a tribe that we belong to, and that same is safe and different is dangerous. Yep. And I can imagine that going back hundreds of thousands of years in our cultural evolution. And maybe, someday they'll find out that there are biological dimensions to it as well. But suddenly we realize that we're in a different stage of human history and development than we were 100,000 years ago. No longer is the greatest threat to my existence a threat to my tribe. Right. Now, in some ways, the greatest threat to all of us is our hostility between our different subgroups, and this creates this like an evolutionary problem. I think a problem in our human development, and that's where I think when you and others use a word like radical love. Part of what we're saying is it's not just the love of the little us. That's right. But it's a deeper love that takes us beyond to others. And eventually I think we're going to have to come to terms with it's not only love for other people, but it's also love for, the whole planet and to whom we're all, to which we're all bound.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I think but I know that one of the challenges here is to talk about and inhabit and experience love in multifaceted, complex ways.
Yeah.
Right? And so that it's not reducible down to one thing. It's not reducible down to one expression or one form. I was thinking as you were talking about, Freud. When Freud conjectures about the id and the superego, he's saying, well, the superego is our conscience. It keeps our id, all these animalities in check. But he does transliterations of this in texts like Moses and monotheism, and the kind of the tendency to tribalism and the ways in which we negotiate those differences or not, right? Yeah. But Freud was quite mindful of the fact that we're constantly seeking to annihilate another. right?
Yes.
Right. And so that, that kind of, that drive to annihilation is as much a part of us as, say, the drive to, an attractive other, right?
Yes, yes.
And so,
Yeah.
so maybe this is the tricky part, right? How do we encourage folks and ourselves to be both humble in our loves and in what we mean by love, but also robust in our advocacy for it?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a huge part of that begins by us dropping the word "of course" when we talk about love, because
Very good. Yeah.
in one sense, everybody's for it in
Yep.
theory, but if we don't realize the psychological,
That's right.
the sociological dimensions that are working against it, and that in fact are working against it in a never-ending way. It's a problem that never gets solved. If we establish the people who believe in radical love, very quickly we can start hating the people who don't agree with us.
Yeah, right. And I think one of the tricks here, and I think this is what you mean by the "of course" as well, is that there's a need to have a critical sense about the power of love, such that we don't feel like we have the arrogant possession of perfect love.
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
And the religions will, in very varying forms and varying ways, give examples of what might be called so-called perfect love.
Yeah.
And that there's all sorts of attempts to approximate that perfect love. You find this in Christianity, you find this in Buddhism, you find this in Islam, and so on. And I mean, peculiarly, perfection is inimical here, right? It actually works against us.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, well said. And this, and it's funny that a word like humility comes up, because suddenly you realize that if we don't have some sort of practices to keep bringing us back to a willingness to acknowledge that we're not there, if we don't have some practices of self-examination to keep us saying, where have I started to see the other, if not overtly as enemy, maybe I've just made the other invisible, or maybe the other has been reduced to some sort of a type, whatever it is, these constant challenges. And it's one of those things, as we get older, I think, we have to tell younger people, you never grow up, you never get this right, you're never finished. And I'm still, the older I get, the farther I see I have to go,
Yeah, and I mean, you spoke of maturity before. I might use the language of wisdom.
Yeah.
Right. So that experience bears a certain kind of knowingness, a certain kind of knowledge about living.
Yeah.
And hopefully in a way where we live better, if not fully well. So what work is love doing in the Great Spiritual Migration? Right? What work do you hope it to do?
Yeah. Well, in this book, I'm talking about three migrations, three movements that I think are beginning to happen. They have a long way to go, but the first one is, and this is where love really plays this pivotal role, is to say, what would happen if we defined our faith as a way of life, a way of love, as opposed to a system of belief? And again, a lot of people would say, of course, but I do think on a very practical level, on a very deep level, for a lot of us, our faiths are defined by systems of belief. And love becomes kind of nice icing on the cake, but it's still cake without the icing. We actually have plenty of texts in our sacred texts, that tell us without love you're nothing.
Right.
The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself in love, is one of Paul's statements. So what would happen if we actually took that far more seriously? There have been a lot of people, Harvey Cox and others, who've gone back and looked at how the Christian faith became self-identified with a system of beliefs.
Right.
But, my Jewish friends say to me, yeah, we never really got that about you Christians. We don't really define ourselves as a system of belief in that way, So I think this is an opportunity. And if we say what we're really about is a way of life, which is a way of love, it puts us back in the stage of beginners,
Sure.
I have a sister-in-law who's a professor of math education, And a couple of years ago, we were talking, and she was explaining to me how we really know a lot about what operations of what mathematical operations a 4-year-old can handle, and an 8-year-old and a 12-year-old, and I thought to myself, isn't it interesting that in the world of mathematics we have a pretty good heuristic, but in the teaching of what it means to become compassionate, loving people, it just hasn't risen that far that we really have taken it that seriously. How that's done. It seems to me we need to do that as we move on.
Yeah, I'm reminded of James Fowler's book on Stages of Faith, where he takes Kohlbergian developmental psychology and adapts it to spiritual development.
Yes.
I guess one of the potentially troubling qualities of that view is the hierarchy, or the kind of ineluctable progress that it implies. Right? As opposed to this kind of, not circularity, but a kind of a spiral, right? Because certainly we may progress in thinking, we may progress in critical thought, but we stumble.
Yes.
Right. And the sheer fact of being human is also a statement of the fact of our imperfection.
Yes.
Right.
I think the image of a spiral helps us a lot there, because in fact, I've done some writing about this. I became really intrigued with developmental psychology back when I was in graduate school, and so I read everybody I could and all the different schema. And so I simplified them into a little 4-stage process, but I said, you really need to talk about this not as a line, certainly not as an ascending line, but as a spiral. And my analogy to it is, if you think of, you go through winter, spring, summer, and fall, but that's 1 year. Right. And then you go through winter, spring, summer, and fall on another level and another level. And I think if we keep that in mind, we're never done.
So it's funny. I think about this when I used to coach my kids in sports before they got too good for me to coach them. That you can get really good at baseball or basketball or soccer, but of course there's always the game. Yeah. And the Golden State Warriors notwithstanding, one loses. Right. Yes. And things break down, and that you have to revisit and retool and condition and all those kinds of things. Can I go back to the what you're saying about the way of, rather than a system of beliefs, but talking about the way of love and way of life? Yeah. Can you give me examples of what would make that in a compelling argument to somebody who says, would say to you, well, Brian, look, I already know the right thing to believe. Right, and that structures my way of living and way of loving. Yeah, right.
This is very much, I think, the mindset that I grew up with. The idea was, if you have the right beliefs will automatically translate into the right behavior. Right. And I think you could make a case that that's a characteristic of a kind of modernist view, a Cartesian view, and so on. Be that as it may, we've got hundreds of years of people working on that premise. It's pretty hard after the 20th century to hold that premise anymore. I mean, I think a huge impact of the Holocaust was to say that, that moral knowledge, personal knowledge, what Michael Polanyi called personal knowledge, and other kinds of knowledge, they are not as related as we thought they were. Yeah. And then we start to realize that and this is where organizations like the Charter for Compassion and the work that you're doing, David, I think it's helping us realize that in our different traditions, there are incredible resources, and there are places where this priority of compassion and love and so on, where it really has been cherished. That's a place, I think, where we can then bring those treasures to one another. First, discover them within our own tradition, and then bring them to bear or bring them as gifts to one another. But and this is where life might really get interesting in the next few generations, because if we stopped arguing about whose beliefs were right or wrong, and we started saying, look, we need to learn how to love. What resources do you bring to the table? Right. It's a very different discussion.
Well, and as you know, one of the one of the things I like about that formulation is that it's about an invitation as opposed to a declaration.
Yeah.
Right. So let me invite you
Yeah.
to think about love. Let me invite you to live in a loving way, as opposed to saying to you, by the way, this is how one ought to live. Right?
Yes.
Right.
And these things are also, I'm sure they're so contextual, but one of my favorite writers was a Catholic novelist named Walker Percy, and
Oh, sure.
Walker Percy drew on an idea inherent in Soren Kierkegaard's work, that we're in a predicament, that none of us are in, this gravity-free environment of objectivity, but we're actually in a predicament, and that's not a bad thing.
That's right.
But that's the reality, and so our work happens within the predicament that we happen to be born in. So here we are, 21st century, nuclear weapons, rising global temperature, resurgence of certain kinds of extremist fundamentalism, needs to deal with issues of fuel, how we run our economy, problems of refugee migration that are only going to intensify in the coming decades. There's a recipe for a world that needs a message of how we treat one another.
No, absolutely. But I was thinking about this when you were talking about the evidence of the 20th century, and the one would think the effects or the chastening effect this would have had on not just Christians, but all religious believers.
Yeah.
I'm thinking especially the effect that the First World War had, for example, on European theologians, right, and European thinkers and artists.
Yeah.
It was this profound chastening, and the response wasn't, oh, well, the world needs our help. The response was despair, right? Deep anxiety, a sense of the absence of any kind of ready solace.
Yeah.
Right. One of the curiosities to me about, and I'm not just saying this about progressive or evangelical Christians, I'm not saying this about fundamentalists and so on, is, why there seems to be an absence of a comparable chastening in the face of the, more catastrophes than we can really catalog.
Right? Yeah. I was, years ago, 2007, I was working on a book on global crises, and I came across almost the identical quote from a number of different people, and they said something like this, whether they were talking about global water and sanitation, global loss of soil quality, climate change, extinction of species. Here's what they would say: if you aren't tempted to despair, you don't understand the problem. Right. And I just think there's a sense that we're so afraid of despair that we make sure we don't really face the gravity of the problem. Right. But this might be a place where, for me as a Christian, the idea of death and resurrection, in other words, that the worst thing, that despair it can actually lead you through a kind of death that opens up new possibilities that you would never get to if you stay in denial of the gravity of the problem. So I do think this is one of our great struggles. Reality has a way of, defeating even our denial.
Right. Well, but I could, one of my impression is, even in that story of death and resurrection that you're describing, right, that for some folks, Christian or otherwise, that they have hope predicated on that.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And as as opposed to a hope that is born out of that direct confrontation and grappling with despair.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of those gifts you'd never wish on anybody.
That's right.
But it actually ends up being a gift that nobody would ask for. Right. That when you fight it off and you can't escape it, and it actually defeats you, then on the other side of it, whether it's, and we've all experienced it, sometimes we find we've done something horrible and we just think, I never could have done something like that, and I did. And it's this awareness, this loss of an illusion about your own goodness, or when it's about our political party or our religion or our nation, it is incredibly painful.
It is painful, and it is within the ken of what we might call theodicy, or the problem of evil.
Yeah.
right? When Augustine calls the problem of evil the privation of the good and implicates us in that,
Yeah.
he's saying, well, when we will that privation of good, right, we're
Yeah.
participating in evil in the world.
Yeah.
And that sense of accountability, that sense of complicity, that sense of responsibility of participating in the privation of the good
Yeah.
is something that I do think is missing and seems to be something that would have to be tied to any agenda about radical love, any agenda about a public theology animated by love.
As soon as you say that, I can't help but think of the 12 steps,
Sure.
these first couple of steps of admitting that we're powerless, admitting that we're insane,
Right.
the importance of, as you say, this.
Well, admitting first that we have a problem.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. This really, it really is important. And in the midst of, and it's fascinating to watch us flirt with this in our political rituals every 4 years, where in one sense the key to winning an election is identifying a problem,
Right.
but then we find always we can blame the other party for the problem or the other faction of our party for the problem without ever really owning, hey, this is a human problem. This is our problem. We're in this together.
Well, and it goes back to what you were saying earlier about, the kind of encompassing we, the collectivity, that is beyond kind of the parochialisms of community, even the parochialisms. And when I say parochialisms of tradition, I'm not trying to diminish traditions.
Yeah.
To me, traditions are super, super important.
Yeah.
But in many ways, that I feel like we're in this moment where, a deep appreciation of what those traditions are.
Yeah.
It's tenuous. It feels tenuous.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think here's where I've watched this play out in my own religious tradition. Where on the one hand, we know that we have skeletons in our closet. On the other hand, we're afraid to admit them because we think that will make us have less of a legitimacy to exist.
Right. That's right.
So then we suppress that, which gives us less legitimacy to exist. Whereas if we were to truly come clean, it would be very humbling, which in an ironic way would increase our legitimacy, I think, and our credibility.
Yeah, and which is also a way of saying that it might give us, maybe not might, it would give each of us a deeper sense of confidence.
Yeah.
A deeper sense of moral confidence. And again, this is the wisdom piece, right? That I learned something through that struggle. I learned something through being honest and candid about my faults as much as my strengths, my weaknesses as much as my abilities.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this when you're talking about difference and danger, right? And I've been thinking a lot about that formulation too, the ways in which our encounters with difference are often perceived as dangerous.
Yeah.
Right. They're probably perceived as less dangerous if we recognize the commonalities in the difference, right?
Yes, that's right. And I think one of the great contributions, although it's been abused and the point has been missed, but you think of one of St. Paul's great images is that different members of the body, their difference is actually the gift they bring to each other. And I think this is one of our great challenges to see our differences as gifts. Certainly, there are irritations at times. Sure. Certainly, they just seem abnormal when they're different. But we press through that and we suddenly discover the possibility of a real gift. And I think this is one of our great challenges. It's one of the things, for you as a professor that I think a liberal arts education is supposed to do. It's supposed to help us discover and appreciate the gifts that other times and other cultures and so on bring.
Well, I appreciate that, and it's something I reflect on a lot, for sure. As it is the season of elections, it would be remiss not to talk a bit about that with you. I know in our conversations that you have expressed a distress around, not just around the elections themselves, but around sort of what the elections seem to have been inducing in the culture, or maybe revealing about the culture, right?
Yeah.
A kind of a pronounced enmity, a readiness to name enemy, let alone friend. Can you speak to us about how you're thinking about this, how you're thinking about our modes of redressing this situation?
Yeah. Well, first, the United States has been going for a long time, mm-hmm. and I know that our politics have been dirty mm-hmm. For a long time, and somehow we've survived. And sometimes I wonder if politics isn't just a form of professional wrestling where we all get to cheer and yell and get out some aggression,
Except that game's always rigged.
Yeah. There might be other analogies there too. Without going there. But, there probably is some value to letting people express their hostilities and vent them and maybe get sick of them, after a long election so that we just think, okay, let's all get along now. So I acknowledge that could be a reality. But I also have to say that, one of the things that systems thinking tells us is that there are unintended consequences of our actions and that there is a way to throw something away. Right. So if the way one side builds victory is by vilifying the other side and they create enmity, hostility, superiority, prejudice, misunderstanding, that once the election is over, unless somebody comes out and says, okay, that was all a game, let's put that behind us, you end up with toxicity residing in the system. Right. And this is, I think, one of our real problems now. We have so much toxicity that's latent in the system. That's not latent. It's just simmering in the system. And I become increasingly worried about where that toxicity goes, especially in this election when, qualitatively different things are being said. Let's exclude a whole class of people because they're Muslim. Right. Let's deport 11 million people. Mm-hmm. That's a qualitatively different kind of statement than has ever been made since that I can remember.
Yeah. So, but how do we take this on, right? I mean, you use the metaphor of the toxin in the body, and it seems to me that one of the things we're experiencing right now is a liverless, polity.
Yeah.
Right. That we have nothing that seems to be able to filter and handle the toxins in any kind of able way.
Boy, that's a really fascinating way to say it because as soon as you say that, I think we have a lot of people who make money by exploiting the toxin. It's how our media work. Let's keep people afraid. They'll watch after the commercial break. They'll come back and we have something for them to be afraid of. So that's a really worthwhile question. We have rituals that stir up our animosities, but it's hard to find rituals that help us dissipate them, We might wish that our faith communities were doing a better job of that, and maybe they will rise to the occasion, but they're probably going to need some encouragement and help in that regard.
Yeah, no, I think so too. And I go back to many previous generations of, and I'll call them evangelical progressives, whether it's Dorothy Day or Bonhoeffer or Rauschenbusch or Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
I find myself yearning for their contemporary analogs in our moment.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. And I think we have some prospects, I think of someone like Reverend William Barber in North Carolina, the Moral Mondays movement.
Yes.
But that's, these are voices as strong as they are, speaking in a din, in a whirlwind. And again, even speaking for the need for love, are finding it hard to get any kind of register or traction in the broader culture. And so, again, like this is, I do wonder, from where you stand for what the work that you do, how do we present examples? How do we invite as opposed to indict? How do we, and so on.
Well, let me say two things about that. First, I just this morning was reading Thomas Merton.
Oh, yeah.
And in the 1960s, another time fraught with hostility on many levels. Thomas Merton was saying how, as a Trappist, he realized the value of silence.
Right.
Sometimes when people are making such ugly noise, one of the most healing things you can do is be quiet. Of course, as I read that, I thought, yes, but you're writing this down, and
Right.
you're going to have this published,
Right.
which is also a way of saying there's a kind of healing silence to just not add to the hatred.
Right.
And we all go through this,
Right.
Somebody says something really ugly, and like the old proverb, a soft answer turns away wrath. So you don't fight fire with fire, which will just give us a bigger fire, but you respond with gentleness and consideration and moderation and so on. But I also think we have to find some positive and ways of communicating. It's one of the reasons, again, I'm so impressed with the work you and others are doing to talk about love as a public practice. And I'm interested in doing this too. And I'm interested in finding ways to encourage our faith communities, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh, etc., to make this part of their public contribution. It's ironic if we don't let voices like those rise. You mentioned Reverend Barber, who's a great example of this. A lot of us are going to have to start lifting up these voices and helping them get attention, because if we don't lift up those voices, other ones will grab the attention.
Absolutely. And I have increasingly have come to believe that economies of scale have to operate here, by which I mean, the intimate, the one-on-one.
Yeah.
That, I think the grand ambitions of radical or public love will be, this will be widespread. But if it's not felt, you've talked a bit about personal experience. If it's not felt on a personal level, if it's not felt intimately, right? I don't think it'll work.
Yes, and here's where we have to think in a more integral way than we thought in the past. So I have to say, look, if I want there to be a more loving world out there, I have to acknowledge how ticked off I am at so-and-so. Right. I have to acknowledge how reactive I am about such and such a subject. And I have to say, part of the problem out there is problem in here. And when I take that seriously, that interestingly has a humbling effect. It makes me more gentle in my approach of others. But then you think, okay, I've got a friend who lives up the street, and we disagree on so many issues politically, and every chance to bring one of them up, he does it, know, and yet we're working on continuing to be neighborly and good to each other. And you realize those little interpersonal changes.
Absolutely.
And I think what we so often do is we skip over the intrapersonal and the interpersonal, and we try to jump to institutional and political changes. And they're important, but we can't miss that deeper personal dimension.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And as you've used the word gentle, and I guess I might use the word tender.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
These kinds of tender mercies that... we all want, we all seek, we all would love to experience ourselves. And yet, many of us, and myself included, have a kind of stinginess of the heart when those tender mercies have to be extended to somebody else, and particularly someone we believe to be, fundamentally opposed to what we want in the world, right? And yet, there are great equalizers. There's illness, there's death, right? And the experiences of those kinds of breakdowns could be, moments of conjunction. Right?
Oh, beautifully said. And I love that word, tenderness. I was a pastor for 24 years, and I have to say one of my favorite things in pastoral ministry was the benediction. It wasn't because I was glad it was over, but the idea of sending people out, and thinking, if from us being together for 75 minutes on a Sunday is going to help these people on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday to wake up and think, I'm going to go into the world as an agent of tenderness today. I'm going to look for somebody to cheer up, somebody to tell them they're doing a good job, to give that little unexpected kindness and so on. Those things accumulate. And if we know that human beings are imitative, And there's an awful lot of bad imitation going on. But the thing I think we have to seize is the power of constructive imitation.
Absolutely. And, to shift the discourse from what am I called to do to who am I called to serve, right? And that kind of the movement to service, the movement toward others, as you say, which is also born, as you have been saying as well, to a movement towards oneself.
Yes.
Right?
And I think one of our challenges in a political season is, in addition to all of those personal issues, we have some ideological challenges. And one of them, I think, is this, that we've been so framed without even realizing it. Even the people who don't believe in evolution have been framed by a kind of Darwinian assumption that the other is my competitor, and survival for the fittest is a competitive game, and if I don't beat you, then you'll beat me. All that kind of stuff that's deeply embedded. It's almost as if we are at a point where we have to teach an ideology of solidarity, where we have to teach. It's as if we have to go back and modify our capitalism and modify our foreign policy and so on to say, look, if you build a wall and the people on the other side of the wall are starving to death, you're not safe.
Right. Right.
But on the other hand, that doesn't mean you don't worry about them. It means if you really want safety for yourself, you actually have to be concerned about the well-being of the person across the border.
That's right.
I mean, somehow that ought to be translatable into a sensible political philosophy.
Absolutely. So, Brian, I want to thank you for taking this time for this conversation. I know it's you, amongst many others, are seeking to advance a form of public good. And I was thinking, as you identified the traditions from which you're a part, right? That I do see you of the social gospel tradition, but as a public theologian, I actually see you of a tradition of what I might call the public gospels, right? And I do commend you on your work, and I consider you a great gift to be in solidarity with you. So thank you, Brian.
Well, I feel the same way, and thank you very much.
All right.